I'll throw out a couple of things that I guess we've discussed briefly via email or that we might speak about. Um, there's a few ways in which institutions are going to be affected by the increase in capabilities of AI systems over the next 5 to 10 years. That might be an interesting topic. I can already see very clearly what some of the impacts on my own institution will be. I suppose the other institutions that might be relevant are what, besides educational institutions, governments. There are public institutions. There are also the effects on the sort of large companies, but that's maybe a little beyond my area of expertise. We also discussed briefly by email this idea of riding the tiger as one of the ways in which it might be difficult to stop bad outcomes. So AI safety as a discipline is, in my view, quite rightly focused on the scenario where you build a very capable AI system and unintentionally it becomes agentic, so agent-like, and becomes very capable. And if it's not aligned, the outcomes for people may sort of by default be very negative, extinction or relegation to kind of reservations on planet Earth where humans are a novelty item, these kinds of things. Besides that concern, there's a set of concerns that are around, well, even if it is aligned in the sense that it doesn't wipe humans out, still the singularity may be very tough for meatbags to navigate or even understand what's happening. And we're likely to see, before we get to anything completely incomprehensible, the oncoming storm of that phenomenon. So the riding the tiger idea was that we might sign up for transformative economic progress and other forms of progress because it'll just seem impossible to not opt in, right? We'll have these systems. If things go as I expect and many people expect, then at some point over the next 10 years, we'll start to rack up higher rates of economic growth, 2, then 3, then 4, then 7, then 8. And at every moment, it'll just seem like these tools make us more and more productive, and it will. But at some point, each individual person will start to feel that they have no idea what's going on anymore. And that point probably has already been passed for most people, right? Most people.
I was going to say, I think a lot of people are there already.
And I know, for example, my wife, so Lavender definitely feels like what's going on in AI is interesting, but because she doesn't understand it, she finds it intrinsically scary, not in the sense of like a physical threat, but just the unanticipated consequences they're just scary because they're unknown. And we'll quickly reach a point where this is true for all humans. Even the brightest human will just have, not in the sense that, we already don't know what's going on, right? Nobody really understands the market. Even people who are players in large governments don't really understand what the government is doing most of the time. But we've sort of gotten used to those. I suppose Kafka is the harbinger of all things. And we've sort of accommodated ourselves to those systems. But those effects could become orders of magnitude more pronounced. And that's the tiger, that complex system in which we have no idea what's going on. And it'll be very difficult to practically turn it off because suppose we're embedded in this system where there's AI running the economy and making us much more productive. To turn it off would be to make yourself uncompetitive compared to others, and B, maybe just 1 million people will starve next week if you start turning things off, as we've seen with the world globalization and the market for foodstuffs. even without a lot of AI in the system. Once it becomes more productive, it's just very difficult to go back. And even if we could do it practically, the coordination required to get everybody to agree to do that may just be beyond our ability to coordinate. Right? Yeah. So that's, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a few things. A bunch of things. Let me just drop a few things in here, just random thoughts that come to mind, and then maybe something larger on your last point. So just, you mentioned lavender. One different response that's it would have been hard for me to anticipate, I think, ahead of time, is the response that Stephanie's having, which is that and it's because of our situation with Kai. But what was Stephanie's, and maybe there are more people in this position than I realize, or whatever. But at least part of it is that there seems to be this uncertainty, but at least in principle, some probability of amazing progress and solutions to problems that are horrible today. Like it's possible that life could get a lot better if your life is terrible, and there's the possibility that life could get better, or if some part of your life is terrible, if you have some massive problem or pain point, source of suffering in your life, and there's the possibility that it could improve. I think some people's response to that possibility is something that's not quite fear, but it's sort of dread to even think about it. So you dread to get your hopes up, and you want to avoid contemplating or thinking about the possibility, because it's too painful to dwell on it and to get your hopes up, and then maybe they'll get dashed or they won't. You just don't know. I don't struggle with that so much personally. I'm pretty darn optimistic and about things, and I figure if
undermines your
it's all
ability
goes terribly
to
wrong,
accept the present, I guess, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's that too. Absolutely, it's this living in the future, living for the future does it does in a way undermine your the meaning and the value of the now. So there's this. I think that some people have that response to all of the technology disruptions that my team talks about. They're even though the brighter future is not that far off, even though it's potentially just a decade or two away. I mean, that's a long time for people who are really suffering, and sometimes people just don't want to hear the good news. Because it's just either there's a fear it won't benefit them, or they'll somehow miss out, or it's too far away, and they don't want people sort of Pollyannaing, or is that the right word? Just being optimistic and cheerful about stuff, because it's painful to think about. So anyway, that's one thing that comes to mind. Well, that's almost like a random thought, but I don't know how much relevance it has. One thing, however, getting to your main question, I think, which is AI institutions, and in particular, the Kafkaesque institutions. One reason why I think. And I think I mentioned this didn't I say Frankenstein's monster and Leviathan and these examples of those are older ideas, and I think I forget, Durkheim and Weber and other sociologists talked about bureaucracy in different ways, and I don't know, if you come forward to the postmodern era, you get folks like Foucault and I don't know these other intellectuals talking about how systems sort of end up with a life of their own. Institutions can end up with a life of their own. They can, at some unit of analysis, some higher than the individual person, you can have institutions, sort of evolving under pressures to have motives and at least dynamics that kind of push them in certain directions, that force them to behave in certain ways. And I think this different language has been used to describe this over the years. Marx and other sociologists and philosophers have used this term, reproduce. So institutions will sort of develop this characteristic they the ones that survive, it's perhaps a little bit Darwinian, but the institutions that persist over time are those that succeed in reproducing themselves over time. They sort of, and reproducing is, again, it's an old-fashioned word, but I think today we would probably call it something like sustain themselves, or achieve some sort of homeostasis, some sort of homeostatic state with anyway, the overarching idea being that these systems develop a bit of a life of their own, and that there is a Kafkaesque, negative dimension to thinking about that. Okay, so here's the concern that I have, which is that once AIs get involved, any of the institutions, and in particular, I'm thinking markets as an institution, but there are other institutions as well. Any institutions that are zero sum, where competition is involved, could get very ugly, because competition that we don't have any control over, that's being undertaken by super intelligent and super capable entities, is going to be absolutely fucking terrifying. And I really mean that. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen the closest thing I can think of is like two big predators or two big animals fighting each other near you. If two lions or whatever at the zoo get cranky with one another. I don't know. I've seen a few things like that. It is so scary. When I think one thing that I remember being cautioned about this, that for children it's very terrifying to see their parents fight, and for children and for women it's very, very frightening to see men fight, because it's this, these are physically more powerful entities that are in conflict with one another, and as a bystander, it's a frightening, very, very frightening prospect. Okay, well, so multiply that by like 1 billion, and that's what two fighting AGIs or super ASIs or just SIs, and it's just super intelligent AI systems that are not fully general or whatever. That's pretty frightening, right? But we already have the beginnings of that. I mean, don't we have adversarial networks as a big approach to making improvements and so on?
So just to
I'm
dig into that a little bit. Why do you think that would be more scary than watching? I mean, Apple is doing its best to take Facebook out currently, right? It's decimated its ad revenue and it's succeeding. This is a fight at the scale of very large, well-funded institutions, but I don't think it strikes most people as particularly scary unless you're in the leadership team at Facebook.
I think a much better analogy, and where it is frightening, is between nations, because companies fighting each other, there's always sort of a sense in the background that we could pull the plug on all this. We could just send in the army. We could just, the president could make a phone call. We could torpedo these companies. Yeah, they're big, they're rich, but we could, it's just Apple and Facebook fighting. And if we wanted to, we could, someone could step in and stop the fight. There's a referee, and the referee could just step in and stop this. It's a boxing match. It's not two people really trying to murder each other. And that's a very different, I think, situation than two nations that are at war. And two nations at war is genuinely terrifying for people, everybody, for onlookers, for the people obviously involved, everything, because there's that's it. You've crossed into no holds barred, no rules, violence is on the table. You're no longer, engaging in conversation. That is a genuinely frightening situation. So I think war is maybe a better metaphor here. The whole thing being that AGI is something that we wouldn't necessarily have control over. Now, if we have control over it, well, then it's just a super effective, competitive system, enterprise, whatever. But if it's an independent autonomous agent that doesn't answer to us or to anything but itself, then that's pretty scary. So anyway, that's one thing. Another question, another possibility that comes to mind is, I do wonder if we will see. I think you might have mentioned this, maybe Dan, in the past. I know some people on my team have brought it up. There's this idea that we could have a return to planned economies, and that a planned economy with AI behind it could give markets a run for their money, because markets are far from perfect. They're just better than the planned economies we've managed in the past. But markets are not perfect. Markets are, without good regulation, they're pretty terrible in many instances. They run off the rails, and monopolistic, monopoly, duopoly, and other dynamics can be very inefficient, and you don't get the benefits of the wonderful benefits of functioning markets. You get the dysfunctional markets that are either they're inefficient up to some point, and then at some point we end up just calling them failed. And market failure is a big problem. Some countries have it worse than others. We have, I would say, in the United States, market failure in health insurance, and maybe healthcare more broadly. Certainly in health insurance, it's an utterly failed market in my mind. But I'm biased, obviously, because of my personal experience with it now in my family. But at any rate, it's there are markets that are not producing optimal social or economic results. Never mind even the other externalities like environmental results or political results or so forth. And so what I wonder is if and China comes to mind, obviously, if a planned economy powered by AI really worked, then it could give market economies a run for their money. And then what might the implications of that be?
Yeah, it's being seriously discussed in China at high levels.
It doesn't surprise me. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, it's...
So yeah, those are sort of some initial thoughts on this general topic, and on in response to what you said, as a crude first pass at this. What do you think?
Yeah, I suppose I wonder whether it's easy to conflate the different kinds of risks from AI, right? So on the one hand, we have the risk of it being unaligned and uncontrolled and dangerous and so on, or being deployed by people in a way that's dangerous. But this kind of riding the tiger, this seems to me basically what sustained economic growth looks like. So I guess a question I have is that, is this actually a concern? And to the extent it is a concern, is it a concern that needs to be, in some sense, deliberately overlooked? So I think an issue that's going to arise in a much more compressed time frame than what we saw during the Industrial Revolutions was, no doubt what's coming will make many people deeply uncomfortable and eliminate their jobs, and whatever social safety nets get put in place will be maybe delayed or not exist. And there will be a constituency in democracies pushing in both directions, to go faster and to slow down or stop. And those considerations will, you can see actually the political lines forming already. It's very interesting. So there's, I don't know if you followed the saga with Timnit Gebru at Google. So
remind me.
Yeah, so Timnit Gebru is a researcher in, I suppose you could call it you could call it safety of large-scale machine learning, but not in the sense of AI is taking over the world, but just the impacts on minorities and women and of systems that are trained at, say, Google on certain data sets that have bias in them, and then releasing those models on the world so that your interaction with these automated systems becomes skewed in various ways that are subtle and distributed and have impacts on people that are hard to understand, or perhaps very blatant, as is the case with well-known examples of, say, melanoma scanners for skin cancer just not doing a good job with black skin, or language models having opinions about whether women can be doctors and this kind of thing. So Timnit Gebru was part of a group, or maybe headed the group, I forget, within Google, who was studying these kinds of impacts on people social impacts of deep learning systems at scale. And she had a disagreement with Google about some of her work and was ultimately fired, essentially, I think. So this particular case is not so relevant to what I want to say, but her message and her view on the impacts these systems are likely to have and who controls them, which is the ultimate question here, right? So who gets to decide when a model is released, and who gets to decide which impacts are acceptable in the name of progress? This is going to be a very contentious issue, because it won't be the case that we'll ever get these systems to have no negative impacts, right? Or at least it's impossible to imagine a world in which, unless there's very strong regulation, this trade-off just is just placed at zero or infinity or whatever, right? There will always be the economic value of deploying these systems will be so high that some downsides will be viewed as tolerable. And where that lever is set will be like a key policy question for the remainder of our lives. So I guess it's, I don't know personally where I would actually put this setting. Because, yeah, like you were saying earlier, there's no constituency for the problems that people don't think will be solved, but will in fact be solved. So there are many medical issues that will get solved with high probability if these systems just become very capable. But those people won't get a say probably in whether these systems go faster or slower. Who will get a say are the groups who stand to lose immediately or in the short term. And yeah, so I guess that's one of the issues when I look at, say, stories around Timnit-Gebru or the concerns around social impacts of these technologies. It's very hard to get a sense of where the right place to stand is. I think there are plenty of people just kind of want to release everything and see what happens. And then there's a position where you just kind of want to stop, or at least, I'm not saying that's Timnit-Gebru's position, and I have a lot of respect for her work, and Rachel Thomas is someone I know who's working on similar topics. But yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with that specific case. I have read about it in the news that I wouldn't have placed the name, but an important Google person, I think, with academic credentials was trying to study this and then put some things into practice at Google, and then it was I don't know, for a variety of different reasons, perhaps, partly substantive, and I think partly personality clashes and some moral and grandstanding and a few other things. It ended up turning very sour, and there was an acrimonious parting of the ways there. But I think my understanding is it's done a good job of raising public awareness of the risks, at least in the short term, that some of these technologies have at exacerbating existing inequities, injustices that just the world is full of, rather than making the world a better place. And so I land in a similar place, I think, to where you are, which is that I'm not exactly sure how to weigh the benefits and the detriments in the short term. So the qualification that I would put on there is that I'm not sure how to, sort of land on a way to make good choices or decisions about this in the short term. In the long term, and by long term, I guess it gets us out to singularities, that horizon, and we just have to throw everything, we just flip the table. So I guess we're not worrying too much about the long term, honestly, because it's too hard to even think about. But yeah, in the long term, if it's hard to avoid conclusions like, on a longer time horizon, do whatever maximizes growth or maximizes productivity, because you're going to solve all the other problems if you do that, and you're going to solve them sooner rather than later. And so just put up with problems, whatever they might be in the short run, because you'll get to the finish line of every problem that we can think of right now being solved or solvable. But that's sort of a cop out, and you can default to that and end up in a very sort of cult of, it's almost like waiting for it's been mocked, waiting for the rapture of the nerds, basically, the whole singularity.
Or just those
magical AI is just going to swoop in and save the day and solve all of our problems.
Or it just gets conflated with the position of the poor suffer what they must, right? So
yes, well, that's what it's always been in the past, and the promise has always been in the afterlife. Well, now it's a promise of afterlife, but it's not like literally a different, a separate universe or world. It's just the world, not now, but at some point in the future. And so it's actually a bit more of an afterlife. It's a little more literal, maybe a little more plausible, but it's the same thinking. It's just wait, just hang in there, everything will be fine. And just, the poor suffer what they must. Exactly. So I think obviously we need to be cognizant. We need to be sensitive to these potential pitfalls, especially if they're needless, right? If these are avoidable problems, and avoiding them doesn't come at some obviously enormous cost, which I don't see how they would. I mean, why put out a prejudiced, bigoted language model if that can be avoided, and if there's no downside to it? Now, I guess people could say, well, the downside is that you slow down, you lose your competitive edge, blah blah blah. I don't know. I'm waffling here. I don't have a great
let me put a precise example
hard
to you and see if you have anything to say about this. So Australia, like the US, has become incapable of doing infrastructure in a reasonable time at a reasonable cost. And you could point to that and say, corrupt bureaucrats, and they're just stupid. But when you look closer, actually the problem is much scarier than that. It's actually pretty well-intentioned a lot of the time, right? There's just endless studies about potential impacts, and there is corruption, and there is, too many people in some of these offices, and there's incentives to not do anything and evade responsibility, etc., etc. But a lot of the slowdown really can be attributed to well-intentioned but ultimately mistaken over the long term, negative sort of expected value processes. To take one that sort of coming up now, you could worry about the climate impact of Bitcoin and blockchains, right? And you could say, well, it takes a lot of energy to run this blockchain, and that generates greenhouse gases, and we can't afford any more of that. So maybe we should be against Bitcoin. And you have even the president of the United States coming out and saying things like this. Now, when Biden says it, or Janet Yellen says it, if I get that name correctly, or these figures in finance say it, you know that they have ulterior motives for being against Bitcoin, right? It's got nothing. They don't care about those environmental impacts, but they think they can mobilize support against something they view as threatening by using that.
Right.
And I think one has to be aware that anytime you add these hooks into a system, where you say this is a legitimate reason for going slow, or being against the technology, or stopping, those hooks become live items in a game, right? And they will be deployed for reasons that you would not wish them to be deployed. So I think this is an underappreciated consequence of paying attention or caring about impacts, is that any given thing that leads to the subway in New York costing $1 billion a meter, or whatever it costs, or similar infrastructure disasters in Australia, many of the individual parts of that, they seem reasonable, but when you do a kind of cost-benefit analysis of the number of years of people's lives that are wasted because of bad infrastructure or many other things, you wouldn't actually go for that outcome. But you're in a sense opting for it implicitly by just never saying no to things that slow down or stop processes, or just being sort of generally anti-progress. So I'm curious, I mean, what are the heuristics? I mean, we've become very bad at that as a civilization in the US, Australia. I think you'd agree with that. But what are the heuristics that you can deploy against this creeping into things? I mean, in the case of AI, it's just simply that it's not regulated at all. It's going so fast. The government has no idea what's happening or how to regulate it. They have no competence to do anything. So in some sense, it's negative because there will be negative impacts and no regulation. But while that lasts, it's also free from just being, rare grass studied to death.
Yeah, I mean this is the thing, right? You're talking about a specific type of politicization where issues of a certain, it's a form of politicization where topics of concern become a political football, as we say here in the U.S. They become something that you can you can execute some political machinations over. You can balkanize your constituents over. You can make promises or allocate resources in the name of, et cetera, et cetera. And it carves open a space for within this sort of Kafkaesque machinery for inefficiency to hide, for parasites to latch on. I say parasites, but I mean all of us. So it carves out a space for each of us, and some of us more than others, to benefit from a status quo. And to the extent that we slow things down, or we prop up an existing system, or we bail out something that would otherwise fail, or we do something that's inefficient, we're basically doing writ large was it David Graeber who wrote about bullshit jobs? That a lot of people in bureaucracies, so this is at the individual unit of level of analysis, not at the whole system, where so never mind the whole system having a life of its own. People find a way to carve out a niche where they can survive in that ecosystem, and there's a lot of incentive for doing that, and there's even more incentive, I think, among politicians and so forth, for opening for opening up those niches for people to step into and occupy. And I don't think any of this necessarily has to be conscious at all. It's just that this is the way systems roll. Basically, they emerge and then perpetuate themselves with these sorts of features. So to get to your question, which is how do we, what's this? Is there a saving grace on for AI or for other technology on top of this? And I don't have a great answer to that. I don't pretend to know, but my first instinct was number go up, which is this phenomenon you may have heard of, which is that and I think that's what you're saying, at least partly, which is that it doesn't matter if the new technology is so productive or so performative in some way. It makes such a big difference. It outcompetes, it delivers, it just works. Whatever the overwhelming performance metric might be that we're interested in paying attention to, if that number really goes up, well, then it trumps the rest. And that is itself both perhaps a good thing and a bad thing. If the number going up is something that's really important, then then I guess we end up in a situation where should the poor just suffer their lot in order for the greater glory that's brought by this amazing technology that can deliver on some particular dimension of benefit or utility or whatever. But I don't know. I mean, it's tough. When does it cost to become worth it? When does it turn into a Frankenstein's monster and it's out of our control? These are easy questions to ask and impossible ones to answer, right? So I mean, these are all great questions, but there's nothing but grappling, and I don't know if any clear solutions are. I don't know if they exist even in principle, let alone, I mean, are we gonna grab them? I don't mean to be defeatist about this. Sure. It's fascinating thinking about this.
No.
But it is a bit.
Because I don't expect answers.
It's a little bit, discouraging.
I suppose
I'm discouraged that
points towards
of answering them. Yeah.
Well, it's the kind of answers that politics is designed to figure out by contention and disagreement and argument. And it's unfortunate maybe that the state of our capability for having those discussions is maybe not at its peak. Yeah, maybe we could spend a few minutes talking about what's happening in China, which is quite interesting. I don't know if you followed the last year or two of the kind of crackdown on tech and so on in China.
I haven't. I'm interested to learn, and there are. Yeah, no, I haven't been following it closely enough, but I know in the abstract that major things have happened since the beginning of COVID, and that anyway. So I'm keen to get your take.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. There's been a number of signature policy moves from Xi Jinping. Two of them that maybe bear mentioning in this context are what's widely called the crackdown on tech, which took the form of there were several high-profile parts of it. The founder of Alibaba, Jack Ma, left his position. I don't know what his current relationship is to the company. But Ant Financial, which was a spin-off from Alibaba, its IPO was derailed like days before it was planned to happen as a result of investigations. Didi, they were planning to list overseas, and that was also derailed. I don't know what the state of that is now. These were results of... So I guess from the West, the reporting is often something like, it's in Bloomberg and it comes from people who maybe had investments or wanted to make investments into China in these companies. So it's sort of like bad Chinese government is stepping back from its commitment to free markets and so on. But if you talk to Chinese people, they're like, yeah, fuck Ant Financial. These guys were bastards. So Ant Financial, one of its most popular products were basically, they were loan sharks, but you could apply for a loan on your phone. So you can apply for a small loan to buy a handbag or, some other product, and then you have high rates of interest to pay it back. But they were really pushing people to take out these loans because of the network of other apps they have, and quite predatory, and, really people had a very negative view of their social impact. And the government at some point just took notice of this and acted. Also, Jack Ma was walking around basically saying he was above the financial regulators. So a lot of these new era finance companies in China, they have a control over the economy that's maybe, if you're not paying attention, you would find surprising, given the reputation of the Chinese government for having their sort of tight grip on things. So you must know that WeChat is kind of the operating system of China. Everybody pays for everything with WeChat, cash.
Yeah, my impression is that that's what Elon Musk wants to turn Twitter, at least partly, into WeChat for the West, and that's his interest in the platform. That's my impression, is that he wants to return to X.com days, and his original vision for X.com and later PayPal was an entirely new payment system, and WeChat is sort of the closest realization of that. And anyway, yeah, so I'm familiar with WeChat.
Right. Yeah, to the extent that if you go to a tourist site in China, the beggars want you to pay in WeChat. They'll have QR codes next to their spots. They don't want cash.
Wow.
They don't do anything with cash.
That's amazing.
Nobody walking past them has cash anyway. It was like switch to a QR code or die, basically. Okay, anyway, so that means that the Tencent controls WeChat, and that's a huge source of... they have all that data, and of course some of it goes to the government, but it's never quite clear how much. But in any case, they have huge leverage over the entire economic system as a result of that movement of people onto apps to a degree that is much further than anywhere else in the world, as far as I'm aware. And Alibaba and Ant Financial had similar desires to be a linchpin of the economic system and take that power. But in China, I mean, in the US, I guess businessmen kind of see themselves as apart from politics, apart from when they need to lobby the government, or I mean, they certainly interfere in politics, but they're viewed as somewhat separate activities. But this barrier is much more permeable in China, where every super successful Chinese man wants to be the emperor, right? So Jack Ma kind of fashioned himself as being more powerful than could be tolerated by the government, and so he fell. And that was part of a wider crackdown on tech. Sort of, those examples give you an idea of why, right? So the tech companies had increasing power in the economy and control over people's lives, but abused that power in various ways, and people were looking to the government to act, and so they did. And then another very impactful policy change has been around education. So you may have seen that out-of-school classes were supposedly made illegal in China, and this was a huge industry and a growth industry. Lots of people worked as tutors outside of schools, and these were shut down in principle. In practice, people are still going to them. They're just the out-of-school classes, they have a sign on the door saying, "We're shut," but everybody just goes inside and everybody knows it. But in principle, the sector has taken a big hit. Okay, so what's this got to do with the topic of our discussion?
Sorry, just real quickly, what was the motivation behind cracking down on the tutoring industry? What was the ostensible rationalization for that?
Yeah, there's several. I'll list two or three of the most obvious ones. One is that, China's really different, man. Okay, so a lot of schools basically stopped teaching in their regular classes and just assumed you'd learned it at the out-of-school classes. And they made most of their money from the out-of-school classes. So you would have the same teachers who were supposed to be teaching in, say, the public school. They would work in the evenings at the tutoring school. And there they would teach you what you actually need to know. And in the actual classes, you would come in. So Friends of Lavenders, their children, I've heard stories from people about this. The kid goes into the classroom and the teacher says, "Okay, so I assume you know how to do fractions, right? Everybody learned fractions." They didn't teach fractions. It's just, you're supposed to have learned it in the out-of-school class. Okay, so you have to go to the out-of-school class, otherwise you're behind, and then you have to pay. So this is a way of public schools profiting off their control of the education of young people, and this was very widespread. So there's like incredibly corrupt, disgusting things like this going on. That's one reason. Just the general, the amount of money in the out-of-school classes was corrupting the education system to a very large degree. And this had been going on for a long time, but had reached a point where people were really angry about it. And secondly, the level of pressure on young people in China has become so extreme that I think it's almost like child abuse. Maybe that's maybe that's too cowardly. It is child abuse. It's very clearly child abuse by any Western standard. What the degree to which children are subjected to high pressure, high stakes examination, and even the most well-intentioned parent can't shield them from that. It's horrible. It is destroying the mental health of generation after generation. Most Chinese students will tell you this if you ask them about it. And to have people in our generation raising their kids, putting their kids through this, it breaks them in half to take a happy young kid and send them to school. It's horrible. And
that's heartbreaking to hear. Jeez.
And it's become so horrible that people are just really desperate. And so the government is trying to do something about all these issues, somewhat ham-fistedly and 5 years too late, and therefore it has to be very extreme and so on. But you can understand why they're doing it, like with many things Xi Jinping does. You can sort of see a rationale, but the execution is just like so. I mean, both of these policies have been carried out in a way that's kind of self-destructive, I would say.
Okay.
Man.
Yeah,
to come back to the topic, I think especially the effects in the education system are, I think, indicative of things we will get to experience as a result of more pervasive AI. So maybe this is a topic we can flesh out a bit later. But what is intelligence for in the first analysis, right? So where did nervous systems come from? Well, you first evolve an eye, and then you need to hook it up to your motor system to move away from a predator, right? You first get the sensory organ, but then you need to process that sense data to form action. So the intelligence is part of just being able to perceive the world, right? You need intelligence to perceive because you have to filter out what matters and what doesn't. And as it currently stands, our world is very complicated in a way that we can't really perceive in that sense. So it's just there's lots of complexity and we can't understand it, so we don't try. You can see the effect, though, of attempting to try. So if you attempt to see through a nation of 1.4 billion people to figure out who's intelligent and who's not, and then just play out what that means once you have that data, it means generation after generation of millions of children being subjected to high-stakes testing to figure out how to stratify society into IQ classes, to figure out who the elite are. And it's a terrible, terrible burden once you commit yourself to seeing clearly. The effects are catastrophic on human life. And I do worry that once surveillance is an aspect of that, but more generally, once we acquire the ability to see ourselves as a culture, as a world more clearly, at very high granularity, the effects of acquiring that understanding will be, it will be very hard to turn away. I mean, it's very hard for Chinese people to get out of that equilibrium, right? It's hard to opt out of the exam system. You're just going to doom your child to having no prospects. There's lots of equilibria like that once we see more clearly, we have a risk of just falling into, I think.
So I guess one for these conversations, probably one thing we ought to ask ourselves for any of these sort of big, a meta question, a question about the questions we're asking. Or maybe it's just a criteria that we ought to apply is on what time horizon does this problem emerge, then manifest, and ultimately does that overlap with the limit of the horizon that we've set from where we can have meaningful we can do some combination of making meaningful projections and surmising a little bit about the future that we can predict with some plausibility what the future state of the world might be, or the future state of any portion of it, and then does the problem become severe enough? Does it have the potential to become severe enough? And by severe, I mean, does it have the potential to cause a very large amount of suffering within that time frame? And so this sounds. I mean, again, I'm just learning most of this. I'm very, very ignorant about China, and it's shameful, but I'm learning most of this for the first time, as you can imagine. And so it is a gruesome reality already. This is not some sort of, what you're describing, the situation is not something that may come to pass, but a current part of the status quo that's awful. And it sounds like the question is, will AI and these new technologies make this much worse and cause much more suffering in the near term and for the foreseeable future, basically, before we can get all this stuff fully solved. And so I'm taking that to mean, on the order of 20 years or less. So it sounds like your concern is that on that time scale, things could go from pretty awful to truly nightmarish by, taking an entire generation of people and throwing them into the Hunger Games kind of, even more into some sort of horrible, truly dystopian, dynamic there. And then, of course, the follow-on question is there anything that we can do to prevent that, to push back against that, to stave off the worst of that until such time as, problems do come into view, whatever the form they may be. People no longer need to compete on the basis of merit because it's simply not worth it. That's one possible solution. Another possible solution is everybody just gets an implant and downloads this, or is everybody's equalized by technology in the same way that putting a gun in everybody's hand equalized strength, right? I mean, strength made a big difference for all of human history, and then we invented firearms, and that's it. It didn't matter. No longer mattered at all how strong you were, how young you were, how tough you were, how fast you were. None of that made any difference once you've got a gun in your hand. And it could be that we have, for intellectual stuff as well, we could have, you can imagine I'm holding out some hope for that because of Kai's situation. But we could certainly see combination of one or more solutions to these sorts of problems and emerging on a singularity kind of time horizon. So again, the question is, how much worse can these new technologies make existing problems like this, or create new ones that could persist for half a generation or whatever, and that we really need to be worried about them. And it sounds like this is a truly awful one in the status quo right now in China, and maybe we should really think about what is there a way to, if you can see this coming in advance, is there any way to steer the ship of state around this terrible iceberg that we seem to be headed towards? It sounds like Xi Jinping and the Chinese government at least recognize this horrible situation or trying to do something. But then, if it's too ham-fisted of a response, does it make it worse? I mean, they
don't have any.
Is it worth it? Is what they're doing worse than nothing?
Oh, hard to say. Yeah, I think we'll have to pick this up next time, though. We're sort of over time.
Oh, shoot. Yeah, rats. We're out of time. Rats. I just looked at the clock.
Yeah, but thanks a lot.
Oh, damn. We always. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Dan. It's always super fun. I've got a whole list of things on a piece of paper that I wanted to bring up that I thought of, so we'll have to carry that on next time.
Sounds great.
Good stuff.
Hey, man.